"You're just a blood bag," he mocked. Unaware she was carrying the heir to the throne, the dungeon smelled of iron and old stone. Vesper Coldwell had stopped counting the days by the third week. Time moved differently underground. Not in hours but in hunger pangs, in the rhythm of guards changing shifts, in the slow drip of water somewhere behind the far wall. She sat with her back against the damp stone, knees drawn to her chest, one hand resting quietly over her abdomen. She was careful about that, careful not to let the gesture linger too long whenever the guards watched. Still breathing. The voice came from beyond the iron bars, low, bored, almost amused with itself. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lord Cassian Vale, the vampire who had personally ordered her capture 3 weeks ago on the basis that her bloodline carried rare mineral properties that his kind called auric, a warmth in the blood that sustained their kind longer than ordinary human stock. She was, in his exact words, a resource. She finally lifted her gaze. He stood at the cell door, arms folded, dressed in the dark-fitted coat he always wore, the one with the silver clasp at the collar that caught the torchlight. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they're deciding whether to keep. "You're just a blood bag," he said, almost cheerfully. "A particularly resilient one, I'll give you that. But still." Vesper said nothing. She had learned early that silence unnerved him more than any argument could. He wanted a reaction. Indignation, fear, tearful pleading. She gave him the flat, steady look of a woman who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He left without taking what he'd come for. She exhaled slowly once his footsteps faded, and allowed her hand to press, just gently, against her stomach. Hold on, she thought. Just a little longer. Somewhere above this dungeon was a throne, and the child she was carrying had more right to it than anyone in that palace currently understood. Have you ever had to hide something precious just to keep it safe? Share your thoughts below. Vesper hadn't always been the kind of woman who kept secrets. She had grown up in the border village of Thornfeld, the daughter of a human healer and a mother she never spoke about. Not because the memory hurt, but because the truth was too dangerous to voice aloud. Her mother had been a handmaiden to the late Queen Isadora. Not just any handmaiden. Confidant. The kind of woman who knew which doors in the palace had no locks and which conversations were never meant to leave the room. When Isadora's son, Crown Prince Aldrich, was 23 and Vesper's mother was still young and quietly beautiful, something happened that the court chose to forget. A winter gathering. Too much wine. A genuine tenderness that neither of them had planned for. Her mother had left the palace before anyone noticed. Returned to Thornfeld, raised Vesper alone with careful hands and careful words, and made her swear never to seek out what she came from. Vesper had kept that promise for 26 years. Then Prince Aldrich found her instead. He had come to Thornfeld under a false name, traveling without his court, older than she'd imagined, tired in the way that powerful men sometimes are when they've spent decades performing strength. He'd recognized something in her face immediately. Her mother's eyes, the particular angle of her jaw. They hadn't fallen in love the way stories describe it. It was slower and stranger than that, built out of long evenings and honest conversations and the specific comfort of two people who had both spent their lives feeling slightly outside of everything. By the time she understood what was happening inside her, he was already gone. Called back to the capital by his council, promising to return within the month. He never did. 3 weeks later, Lord Cassian Vale's soldiers arrived in Thornfeld. They weren't looking for Vesper specifically. They were collecting, rounding up auric-blooded humans from border villages like livestock being brought in before a frost. She hadn't fought them. Fighting would have drawn attention to what she was protecting. So she came quietly, kept her hand away from her stomach, kept her expression flat, and waited. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. Vesper knew it was Tuesday because the younger guard, a lanky boy named Pell who felt guilty about his work and showed it by slipping extra bread under the cell door, had mentioned it while avoiding her eyes. He always came on Tuesdays. That morning he didn't bring bread. He brought a physician. The man was vampire-born, pale and precise, carrying a leather case that clicked open with a sound like a small final judgment. Lord Cashin stood behind him in the corridor, watching through the bars with the particular attention he reserved for things he considered his property. "Routine assessment," Cashin said. "We need to know how much your body can sustain before the next draw." The physician approached. Vesper sat very still. She understood immediately what was at stake. A thorough examination, the kind this man was clearly trained to perform, would reveal her condition within minutes. And once Cashin knew she was carrying a child, one of two things would happen. Either he would use it as leverage, or he would decide she was too complicated to keep. Neither outcome was acceptable. She made a decision in the space of a single breath. "I'll tell you something," she said quietly. "That's worth more than whatever you'll find in my blood." Cashin tilted his head. The physician paused. "There's a vault," she continued, keeping her voice steady and her eyes on Cashin specifically, "under the east wing of the Capitol Palace. The old Queen's private vault. I know what's inside it, and I know the only sequence that opens it. My mother put me to sleep to that sequence like a lullaby. The silence that followed was exquisite." She watched Cashin weigh it, the greed moving visibly behind his eyes like weather crossing an open field. The vault of Queen Isadora was legendary. It had never been opened since her death. Every faction in the kingdom had theories about what it contained. He raised one hand. The physician stopped. "Give us the room," Cashin said. The physician left. The guard left. Pell left, shooting her one brief, worried glance over his shoulder. Cashin crouched to her eye level, which she hadn't expected. It made him seem almost human. "Talk," he said. Vesper told him just enough to keep him hungry. She described the vault's location with the confidence of someone who had been there. The narrow servants' corridor behind the East Chapel, the false wall disguised as a linen cupboard, the 7-step sequence her mother had whispered like a prayer. She gave him details that were specific enough to feel real and vague enough to be useless without her present. Cashin listened without interrupting, which she was learning was his version of intense interest. "You've never attempted to access it yourself," he said when she finished. "It wasn't a question. I made a promise to my mother. And now, my mother is dead," Vesper said simply. "And promises have limits." He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, which she could tell he found simultaneously irritating and compelling. Most humans looked away from him. She understood instinctively that looking away would cost her everything. "Why offer this now?" he asked. "Because your physician was about to discover something that would complicate our arrangement," she said carefully. "And I'd rather negotiate from a position of usefulness than become a problem you decide to eliminate." It was the most honest thing she'd said to him. She watched him process it. The admission that she had something to hide, offered voluntarily, which paradoxically made her seem more trustworthy than if she denied it. "What are you hiding?" he asked. "Something that becomes significantly more valuable if you treat me well between now and the capital." She let that settle. "And significantly less valuable if you don't." Another silence, longer this time. Then Cashin stood, smoothed the front of his coat, and called for Pell. "Move her to the upper rooms," he said. "See that she eats properly." Pell's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Vesper kept her expression neutral as she was escorted out of the cell for the first time in 3 weeks, climbing stone stairs toward thin gray daylight that hit her eyes like something physical. She didn't allow herself to feel relief. Relief was a luxury that loosened careful thinking. But she pressed her hand briefly to her abdomen as she walked, hidden in the folds of her threadbare skirt. One step, she thought. We're one step closer. The upper rooms were not comfortable exactly, but they were dry. Vesper was given a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the estate's frost-bitten grounds. She ate the food Pell brought without tasting it, focused entirely on cataloging her new environment. Exits, sight lines, the patrol pattern of the guards outside. On the 3rd evening, she had an unexpected visitor. The woman who entered was vampire-born like Cashin, but where he wore his authority like armor, she wore hers like weather, something simply present, impossible to argue with. She was older, silver-haired, dressed in traveling clothes still dusty from the road. "My name is Marin Vale," she said, settling into the room's single chair without being invited. "Cashin's aunt. And you are considerably more interesting than my nephew realizes." Vesper said nothing. Marin smiled at the silence as though it confirmed something. "I've been to Thornfeld, you know. Years ago. I knew your mother." She paused deliberately. "I knew who she served. And I knew what happened the winter before she left the palace." The air in the room changed. "Then you know what I'm carrying," Vesper said quietly. "I suspected. Now I'm certain." Marin's expression was not unkind. "Does the child's father know?" "He was recalled before I could tell him. Prince Aldrich." Marin said the name without drama, which somehow made it heavier. "He's been searching for you." Quietly, he can't be seen to be looking without explaining why. "But his people have been moving through the border villages for 2 weeks." Vesper's composure cracked slightly at the edges. "Just slightly." "He thinks Cashin took you for the blood harvesting," Marin continued. "He doesn't know about the child. Nobody does except you and I, as of this moment." "Why are you telling me this?" Marin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the frost-stripped trees with a sound like held breath. "Because my nephew is playing at power he doesn't understand," she said finally. "And because the kingdom is going to need what you're carrying more than Cashin needs whatever is in that vault." She stood, smoothed her traveling coat, and moved toward the door. "Rest," she said. "Things will move quickly now. What would you do with information this dangerous? Let us know in the comments." Things moved quickly, but not in the direction Vesper had hoped. 2 days after Marin's visit, Cashin summoned her to the estate's main hall. A vaulted room of dark wood and cold chandelier light that was clearly designed to make people feel small. He was standing at the far end when she entered, and he was not alone. Beside him stood a man she recognized. Not personally, but she knew the insignia on his coat, the silver tree on black, the mark of the Royal Intelligence Bureau. He was one of Aldrich's men, and the expression on his face when he saw her was not relief. It was guilt. "It seems," Cashin said pleasantly, "that you are more interesting than a blood bag after all." He knew. Not everything, she could see that. But enough. Someone had talked. She looked at the intelligence officer and understood in one cold, clarifying moment that he hadn't come to rescue her. He'd come to broker something. Aldrich's people trading information to Cashin in exchange for something she couldn't yet identify. She had been currency in a negotiation she hadn't known was happening. "The vault," Cashin said, "was a clever distraction. I'll give you credit for that. But my aunt talks in her sleep." He tilted his head. "Figuratively speaking." Vesper kept her breathing even. "What do you want?" she asked. "What I've always wanted. Access." He moved toward her slowly, not threateningly, which was almost worse. "Not to the vault. To the throne. A child with royal blood. Raised in my household. Educated in my values. An heir I can shape before the world knows he exists." The room felt very still. "You'd need me alive for that," she said. "Considerably more than alive," he agreed. "Comfortable, even. Cooperative." He stopped a few feet away. "I'm not a monster, Vesper. I'm a strategist. There's a difference." She said nothing. Behind her eyes she was doing rapid, desperate calculations. Marin, Aldrich searching, the officer who'd betrayed her, the child who couldn't afford any of this going wrong. She had walked into the dungeon quietly to protect something precious. She was going to have to make noise now. That night, Vesper didn't sleep. She sat at the narrow window and watched the frost-covered grounds until the patrol pattern became a rhythm she could feel in her chest like a second heartbeat. 2 guards. 90-second intervals. A blind spot at the northeastern corner where the old oak tree interrupted the torchlight. She had one advantage Cashin hadn't considered. He thought her value was passive, something to be contained and utilized. He hadn't once considered that a woman who had survived 3 weeks in his dungeon without breaking, who had negotiated her way out of a medical examination using only words, who had spent her entire life carrying a secret that could reshape a kingdom, might also know how to move through darkness without being seen. Her mother had taught her that too. You are not just what you carry, Vesper. You are what you choose to do with it. She thought about Marin. The older woman had said things would move quickly, and they had, just catastrophically. But Marin hadn't seemed like a woman who left things entirely to chance. The visit, the information about Aldrich searching, the careful way she'd said rest rather than wait. Vesper crossed to the wash basin and lifted it slightly from the wall. Behind it, pressed into a gap in the stone, was a folded piece of paper she hadn't put there. Her hands were steady as she opened it. Contained 3 things. A rough map of the estate's eastern boundary. A time, written as a fraction, the old healer's notation her mother had used for dosing medicines, which meant the hour before dawn. And a single sentence in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow trusted immediately. The prince is 12 miles east. He is not waiting patiently. Vesper almost smiled. She tucked the paper against her skin, lay down on the narrow bed fully clothed, and closed her eyes, not to sleep but to prepare. She ran through everything she knew about the estate's layout, Cashin's habits, Pell's Tuesday guilt, the 90-second patrol gap, the oak tree's shadow. By the time the night deepened toward its coldest, quietest hour, she had a plan. It wasn't elegant, but it was hers. The hour before dawn arrived like a held breath releasing. Vesper moved through the estate's eastern corridor with the particular stillness her mother had called healer's quiet, the ability to exist in a space without disturbing it. She counted steps, avoided the third stair that creaked, kept her back to the wall where the shadows pooled deepest. Pell was at the side door. She had gambled on his guilt and won. He stood aside without a word, not quite looking at her. His jaw tight with the specific tension of someone doing the right thing at considerable personal cost. She touched his arm briefly as she passed. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. He deserved that much. The cold outside was immediate and clarifying. She crossed the grounds using the oak tree's shadow exactly as she'd planned, reached the eastern boundary wall at the spot the map indicated, and found a rope already secured to the other side. She climbed without allowing herself to think about anything except the next handhold. She dropped into the darkness beyond the wall, and Aldrich was there. He looked older than she remembered, not aged, but weathered, the way a person looks after weeks of insufficient sleep and sustained fear. He was on horseback with 4 others, and when he saw her his expression went through several things very quickly before settling on something raw and unguarded that she hadn't expected from a prince. He dismounted before she could speak. "I didn't know," he said, "about Cashin. I swear to you I didn't know they'd taken you." "I know," she said, "and I should have come back sooner. I should have." "Aldrich." She said his name plainly, which stopped him. She took his hand and pressed it gently against her abdomen. The gesture she'd been so carefully hiding for weeks finally allowed to exist openly. The silence that followed was the opposite of every silence she'd endured in that dungeon. This one was full. She watched understanding move across his face. Slow, then sudden, then enormous. "How long?" he whispered. "Long enough that we need to move," she said practically. But she was holding his hand against her, and neither of them pulled away. Behind them, lights appeared in the estate's upper windows. Cashin had noticed she was gone. They rode through the last of the darkness and into a pale, quiet dawn. Cashin did not pursue them far. Vesper learned later that Marin had ensured that, a word in the right ear, a delay in the alarm, the particular sabotage that only someone intimate with a household could arrange. The older woman had played her hand carefully and at exactly the right moment. Vesper made a private note to thank her properly someday. The capital received them 3 days later. Not through the grand entrance. Aldrich was too careful for that, and Vesper too practical. They arrived through the same servants' corridors her mother had once walked, which felt less like irony and more like completion. The kind of full circle that doesn't announce itself but simply settles quietly into place. The royal physician confirmed what Vesper already knew. The council was informed privately, then formally. There were difficult conversations. Men in important coats using careful language to express concerns that were really just thinly veiled versions of "this is inconvenient for our existing arrangements." Aldrich handled them with a patience she found herself newly admiring. He was better at this than he appeared. He had simply been waiting for something worth fighting for. The legal recognition took 6 weeks. The announcement took 1 morning. The kingdom's reaction took considerably longer to fully settle, as kingdoms always do when something fundamental shifts. But the shift happened. Cashin Vale was brought before the capital's tribunal on charges that had been building against him for years. The blood harvesting, the unlawful detention, a catalogue of smaller cruelties that other people had been too frightened to formally name. Having a prince's attention focused on you, it turned out, had a clarifying effect on witness courage. Vesper testified without drama. Just facts, delivered steadily, in the same quiet voice she'd used in that dungeon cell. On the morning her son was born, the first snow of winter was falling outside the palace window. Aldrich was beside her, which she hadn't taken for granted and didn't now. She looked at the child, small, extraordinarily present, entirely himself already, and felt something settle in her chest that had been displaced for a very long time. She had protected him by being still. She had saved him by finally making noise. Both things had been necessary. This story explored what it means to protect something precious while finding the courage to fight for it openly. What was your biggest takeaway? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, consider subscribing for more.